Chapter 21. Pythagoras says that the number is the origin of all things. Certainly the law of number is the key that unlocks the secret of the universe. This from Paul Carus, Reflections on Magic Squares, in 1906. On the morning of Saturday the 2nd of January 1937, Dirac and Mansi married in Holborn Registry Office in central London. He had wed his antiparticle, a woman almost opposite to him in character and temperament, as his father had done 38 years before. That had proved disastrous, resulting in something akin to mutual annihilation, so Dirac may have feared, at least at the back of his mind, that history could repeat itself. It was an overcast day, the crowds in London going about their business after the Christmas holiday, girding themselves for the harshness of winter. The wedding was a simple civil ceremony, with only a few guests, including Dirac's mother and sister, the Blacketts, Isabel Whitehead and her husband. And after lunching with them in a restaurant nearby, the couple returned to their hotel and drove to Brighton. Dirac could not have picked a more conventional place for his honeymoon. For decades it had been the most popular seaside venue in Britain for romantic trysts. It was a particularly raffish town, famous for its two Victorian piers jutting imperiously out to sea, for the pale green domes of its faux oriental pavilion, its future-telling robot, and a host of other tacky attractions. It appears that no photographs were taken of the wedding, but Dirac took reels of them during the vacation, the best of them showing the newlyweds on a pebbled beach, smiling broadly, looking coy and love-struck. Dirac looks comfortable lying on the beach in his ill-fitting three-piece suit, pencils still protruding from the pocket of his jacket. In some of the snaps, it is possible to see a string-operated device that he devised to enable him and Mansi to photograph themselves with no one else present. After the honeymoon, while Mansi was in Budapest with Betty, Dirac looked around Cambridge for a permanent home and discharged his duties as Caucasian professor. 3 weeks after Mansi's departure, rain lashing against the windows of his rooms in St. John's, he was overcome with loneliness, sheltering from the wind and drizzle of the Cambridge winter. He wrote to his wife, "The first love letter I have ever written. Rather late to begin, is it not?" And in 2 passionate letters he wrote in as many days, he revealed an almost Byronic expressiveness. "I realize more and more as time goes on that you are the only girl for me. Before we were married I was afraid that getting married would cause a reaction, but now I feel that I will go on loving you more and more as I get to know you better and see what a dear, sweet girl you are. Do you think you will go on loving me more and more, or is it now as much as it can be?" Dirac had at last fallen in love. In the evenings, he read George Bernard Shaw's Getting Married, retrieved from his father's library, and some books recommended by Mansi, including John Goldsworthy's sprawling Forsyte saga. But Dirac was spending most of his time in a Mansi-obsessed reverie, counting the days to when she was due to return, dreaming of embracing her in bed under a new moon. It was now Mancy's turn to be sensitive about what others might think, brushing aside her worries that the censors in Hungary might be intercepting their mail. Dirac was uninhibited. "You have a very beautiful figure, my darling, so round and charming, and to think that it all belongs to me. Is my love too physical, do you think?" Struggling to find words equal to his passion, he continued, "Mancy, my darling, you are very dear to me. You have made a wonderful alteration in my life. You have made me human. I shall be able to live happily with you even if I have no more success in work. I feel that life for me is worth living if I just make you happy and do nothing else." Mancy appears to be no less intoxicated. "If by any reason, a war or anything, should prevent me from seeing you again, I could never love anybody else," she wrote. She and Betty were getting on well in Budapest, at the Moulin Rouge, skating on the rinks and doing the Charleston on the dance floor after a few glasses of champagne. "I am very happy and being thoroughly spoiled," Betty wrote to Dirac, but was depressed and mourning her father. "He was the finest man I ever knew," she wailed. In Betty's view, her parents had each been the victim of an unfortunate marriage, and she gave Mancy a reason why her parents disliked each other, though this was too personal for Mancy to spell it out in a letter explicitly to her husband. Mancy decided to take Betty in hand and to find her a husband. Despite her little faults, a bit of untidiness and unpunctuality, I shall try to improve her, and she will be a very good wife. Within days, Mancy had decided that her Hungarian friend, Joe Tesler, was the man for her sister-in-law. Kind, gentle, and an essential requirement for Betty, a Roman Catholic. This was one of Mancy's most effective pieces of social engineering. After a brief courtship, Betty married Joe, 6 years her senior, in London in April 1937. In Bristol, Flo was now quite alone. "Some say that I got married rather suddenly," Dirac wrote to his wife. One of the Dons who was surprised by Dirac's marriage was Rutherford, who wrote to Kapitsa, "Our latest news is that Dirac has succumbed to the charm of a Hungarian widow with 2 children," adding cryptically, "I think it will require the ability of an experienced widow to look after him." A few days later, Dirac wrote to tell Kapitsa the news. "Have you heard that I was married during the vacation?" Kapitsa was probably surprised, as he thought he knew Dirac well, but had not even known that he was seeing a woman. Anna Kapitsa quickly wrote to Mancy, though she too had not met her. "Dear Mrs. Dirac, oh, it sounds awfully official, but he did not even write your name. I hope you will be very happy with that strange man, but he is a wonderful creature, and we all love him very much. Do come and see us in the summer. Yours, Anna K." So, after a second honeymoon in Brighton, only a month after the first, Dirac returned to Cambridge with Mancy, who had left her children in Budapest. By late April 1937, they were still looking for a permanent home, and living in a rented house in Huntingdon Road, a short stroll from the Kapitsa's former home. It's not recorded how Dirac referred to her when he introduced her to his university colleagues, but it is quite possible that he described her not as my wife, but by his various appellation as Wigner's sister. This was a surprising choice of words for Dirac, usually fastidious in his choice of words to the point of pedantry. Mansi was Wigner's younger sister. She quickly established herself as one of the most colourful women in the university, holding the dons spellbound as she passed on outrageous gossip about life in Princeton. Dirac looked on adoringly. For all her assertiveness, Mansi was happy to be part of what she liked to call a very old-fashioned Victorian marriage. She regarded it as her duty to her husband to ensure that her husband's meals were ready on time, to put her husband's used clothes in the laundry basket every night before laying out freshly ironed clothes for the next day. She allowed Dirac to set out a few ground rules of the relationship, including an understanding that French must never be spoken conversationally in the home. He wanted to put to rest all memories of his father's linguistic genre and regime. Perhaps surprisingly, she accepted that nothing in their domestic routine should ever interfere with Dirac's work. This apparently caused no friction when they were alone, but it did, on at least one occasion early in their relationship, lead to an embarrassing tiff. Dirac had agreed to go with her to visit friends for afternoon tea, but refused to leave his study because he had not finished thinking. Mansi went alone, made excuses for her husband, and had to put on a brave face when her host took offence. The wary British welcome given to Mansi was made no more congenial by the inclement weather. The first few months of 1937 were one of the wettest periods Cambridge had seen for years. She felt unwelcome in the university, which seemed to be a place for men. Spouses were meant to be agreeable ornaments, decorative but not obtrusive. Colleges did not allow wives to attend dinners except on special occasions, so she had to sit alone with her novels and magazines, while Dirac fulfilled his duty of dining in college at least once a week. One of his colleagues thought that his marriage had lightened his character, though he was still as uncommunicative as ever, as the archaeologist Glendaniel found out when he sat next to him at dinner at St. John's. The soup came and went in. The soup came and went in. The soup came in. The soup came and went in silence. Halfway through the Sol Veronique, I decided the effort must be made and the silence must be broken. But how? Not the weather, not politics, not the simple approach. My name is Daniel. I study megalithic monuments. Have you any views on Stonehenge? I turned to Dirac, who was examining the grapes on the fish. Have you been to the theatre or the cinema this week? I asked innocently. He paused, turned to me with what I suppose was meant to be a kindly smile, and said, "Why do you wish to know?" And the rest of the meal was eaten in silence. By early September, the Diracs had moved into their grand new home, 7 Cavendish Avenue, a detached red brick house south of the town, built 60 years before. It was in a quiet district, carefully checked that they would not be disturbed by the ringing of church bells, and was a 20-minute cycle ride from St. John's College, and had a beautiful garden of almost 2/3 of an acre. In May, Dirac had written out a cheque for £1,902, 10 shillings, which paid for the property in a single transaction, and unlike most married couples, they were unencumbered by a mortgage. The interior decor of the house reflected Hungarian tastes in the late 1920s. Mansi imported much of the furniture from her Budapest apartment, heavy dark wood sideboards and cabinets, capacious living room chairs, gaudy side tables, though Dirac vetoed her most ornate items. Patterned, deep pile carpeting and conventional landscape paintings helped to set the sober decorative tone. Mansi's children joined them in Cambridge and began to study at local schools, where they, with their uncertain, thickly accented English, had to work hard to integrate with other pupils. Although Dirac never legally adopted Judy and Gabriel, he raised them as if they were his own children, and never referred to them as his stepchildren. But he always wanted biological children of his own. A few days after Dirac returned from his honeymoon, he completed his first contribution to cosmology. Had physicists known that he was working on the subject, they would probably have predicted a surprising new insight into the structure of the universe, or perhaps a fresh perspective on Einstein's theory of gravity. But he did neither. In a 650-word letter to Nature that included almost no mathematics, he set out a simple idea about the numbers that describe the universe on the largest scale. As soon as Bohr finished reading the letter for the first time, he walked into Gamo's room in the Copenhagen Institute and said, "Look what happens to people when they get married." Dirac's cosmological idea was not completely original, as it bore the signs of having been strongly influenced by Eddington. Now perceived by many of his peers as a cocksure eccentric, Eddington had largely abandoned research in conventional cosmology, and was spending his time trying to derive some of the most important numbers in science, such as the number of electrons in the universe, not by systematic reasoning, but by pure thought. Most theoreticians, including Einstein, thought that this was hokum. Theoretical physics was about finding general principles, not about explaining numbers that arise in the search. In Rutherford's scabrous words, Eddington was like a religious mystic, and not all there. In his Nature article, Dirac pointed out that the universe is characterized by several numbers that seem to be connected in a simple way, and he focused on three of them, each of them estimates. 1. The number of protons in the observable universe. Experimentally, this number is 10 to the 78. That is, 10 multiplied by itself 77 times. The strength of the electrical force between the electron and a proton divided by the strength of the gravitational force between them. This turns out to be about 1 times 10 to the 39. The distance, finally, 3. The distance across the observable universe divided by the distance across an electron, according to a simple classical picture of the electron, and the value of this figure is also 10 to the 39. The first striking point about these numbers is that they are so much larger than any number that occurs anywhere else in science. 10 to the 39, for example, exceeds the number of atoms in a human body by a factor of 100 billion. The second point is that the largest estimated number, 10 to the 78, is the square of the smaller one. This, Dirac believed, may not be a coincidence, and suggested that these numbers might be related by extremely simple equations, such as the distance across the observable universe divided by the distance across an electron is equal to the linking number times the strength of the electrical force between the electron and a proton divided by the strength of the gravitational force between them. And the number of protons in the observable universe is equal to another linking number times the distance across the observable universe divided by the distance across an electron. Having noted that in both these cases the linking number is about 1, Dirac proposed a generalization that this is always the case. Any two of the huge numbers occurring in nature are connected by a very simple relationship, linking numbers close to 1. This is Dirac's large numbers hypothesis, a consequence of his faith that the laws underlying the workings of the universe are simple. I'll pause there and interject with my own observation. I think Eddington's statement that I've seen, I'd always interpreted it as being that the number of electrons or fundamental particles in the universe was an integer. This was a kind of concept which we can now say, with retrospect, is quite obvious, but there is a number which is that number, is how I'm trying to express it to you now. That having been said, I suppose we now know that the number of each type of individual particle is not constant. And that there is there are long-term processes that change the ratios of protons and neutrons in the universe. The question is Dirac onto anything or not? And I think the prevailing view in physics these days is that while some of these ratios are interesting and can be seen to have relationships one to another, on the whole it is not a particularly fruitful line of inquiry to search for such simple answers to why certain physical constants have the values they do. So Bohr says, look what happens when a man gets married. And Nancy is left reading her magazines and going out to dinner or afternoon tea and not taking her husband and having to suffer indignation social awkwardness is what this book, of course, is about. Dirac's social awkwardness. Despite all his education and his genius, he's socially awkward.